Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at a video from McCullough that, I'm not kidding, did really change everything for me. The title of it is Canada's Weird Left-Wing Anti-American Nationalism. Now, this video really put into words everything that I had felt before through growing up as a Canadian, especially experiences through debating people in university, which is something that I really enjoyed doing, and just talking about politics and foreign policy and everything like this. And this is a topic that I've touched on quite a bit before, of sort of anti-Americanism and Canadian nationalism in terms of generally more of a left-wing sense. However, one thing I do, we'll get into the video, but there is that right-wing sense as well. But it was really a video that sort of unlocked everything for me, and it's something that I've really resonated with. Like I said, I've seen this before, so I just kind of wanted to go through this with you guys if you haven't seen the video before, and sort of add my comments here and there where I have them. So yeah, I think this is a wonderful video already, so let's get into it. Canada's Weird Left-Wing Anti-National Americanism by McCullough. Thank you all very much for those who have subscribed. If you haven't yet, please sure to do so. It all helps the channel. Let's get into it.
In most countries, when we think of nationalism, we think of a right-wing movement. We think of politicians like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage. But in Canada, nationalism is a mostly left-wing movement. The most aggressively nationalistic flag-waving people you are likely to meet in Canada are also very likely to be very supportive of things like socialized medicine and gun control and unregulated abortion, even high levels of immigration. In fact, a recent poll found that self-proclaimed Canadian nationalists were the people most likely to feel positively about multiculturalism in Canada. So how can this be? Well, it's important to remember that nationalism is neither an inherently right-wing nor an inherently left-wing philosophy. It is simply a philosophy that says that the most important thing in politics is protecting the nation. And if a nation defines itself in left-wing terms, it logically follows that the nationalists of that nation will be very left-wing as well, which is the case in Canada. Just a quick clarification before we go any further. I know that people sometimes fight over what exactly a nation is and how it is different from a country or a nation state. In this video, we're going to treat all of these terms as basically interchangeable, which I think is more or less the mainstream understanding of them these days. So anyway, nationalists are all about protecting the nation. But what does that mean? Well, for starters, it means defending the...
So one thing is that generally, on the mark with that one. The one thing is that since this video was made, which I believe was, actually, let me check exactly, 2019, we did have the infamous trucker convoy freedom protests, which, again, some people saw that as nationalist, but I saw more as sort of an anti-Trudeau thing, right? Rather than an anti-vaccine thing. It was anti the current government. However, people on the right also are the aggressive flag-waving types. It's not to say that the conservatives are, they don't do that. However, his main point of that people being supportive of generally left-wing policies, abortion, multiculturalism, immigration, gun control is a little different, where people on the right generally are less, they're more traditionally right-wing on that issue. But yeah, so just that intro alone, the first time I watched this, I was like, wow. Right? Just wow. Okay, thank you for putting that into words.
Idea that your nation has a reason to exist in the first place. You have to be able to look at the national borders and say, yes, these people living in here have enough in common and are united by enough of a shared national purpose to need their own citizenship and government and flag and all the rest. In many cases, nationalism also means explicitly rejecting the idea of being part of some nearby other country. Think of Pakistan separating from India, or South Sudan separating from North Sudan. Once upon a time, the British Empire controlled much of eastern North America. Then in 1776, 13 of Britain's North American colonies left the empire and formed the United States of America. Some of Britain's smaller northeastern colonies did not support the American War of Independence, and these colonies became collectively known as Canada. From the moment of that divide, Canadian nationalism became inseparably tied to anti-Americanism, because the entire existence of what would become the independent nation of Canada traced its origin to the rejection of the creation of the United States. And because the United States was a uniquely political country, a country based around a particular form of government, as opposed to race or religion or geography or something like that, This meant that Canadian nationalism was always destined to be very political as well. Now, in the
For sure. And another thing too is that it wasn't that there were sects of Canadian society that actually had flirted with the idea of joining the United States and really sort of pushing that revolution. But there were some reforms made during this time where Canada, again, it's more complicated than this, but a lot of the leaders of Canada were very authoritarianism in their ways. And there were reforms that were made to sort of ease the population of joining the United States, right? This was a big fear that Britain had at the time. And so there were sects of society that would have wanted to join the United States or, excuse me, would have wanted to do something similar to the United States. But ultimately, overall, it did come that what are we? Well, we're not them. That's the big difference.
First decades after the American Revolution, it was not at all obvious that the Canadian colonies had made the right choice. Unlike the United States, which had successfully established a democratic system of government that was accountable to the white male population, the Canadian colonies continued to be ruled by an authoritarian and corrupt and incompetent British colonial regime that was accountable to no one. By the 1830s, this had led to a lot of riots and protests by the growing Canadian middle class, many of whom wanted their colonies to reject British rule and join the United States. This led in 1838 to the appointment of a guy named Lord Durham as the Governor General of the Canadian colonies. Unlike some of Canada's past governors, Lord Durham was a very respected and intelligent man, and during his brief time as governor, he wrote this big report advising the British on how they could avoid losing Canada to the Americans. His big idea was for Britain to unite all of the Canadian colonies and allow them to rule themselves through their own democratically elected parliament while still remaining part of the British Empire. Here is how he explained it.
Such a union would form a great and powerful people, possessing the means of securing good and responsible government for itself, and which, under the protection of the British Empire, might in some measure counterbalance the preponderant and increasing influence of the United States on the American continent. If we wish to prevent the extension of this influence, it can only be done by raising up for the North American colonist some nationality of his own, by elevating these small and unimportant communities into a society having some objects of a national importance.
I love that. These small and unimportant communities, however, be damned if you ever try and join the Americans.
And by thus giving their inhabitants a country which they will be unwilling to see absorbed, even into one more powerful.
And this is
it was
very
totally
much
right.
what happened. The Canadian colonies were given democratic self-government and eventually unified into a single country. And through this, any interest in joining the United States slowly faded away. And just as Lord Durham predicted, this provided a good context for a sort of Canadian nationalism to grow. At first, it was a nationalism defined by a sort of aggressive gratitude to the British Empire. That is sometimes known as the philosophy of loyalism. Here is how the famous Canadian historian J.L. Granatstein defines loyalism in his very good book entitled Yankee Go Home, Canadians and Anti-Americanism.
One of the many aims of those who created the tradition was to argue that there had been and still were important distinctions between Canadians and Americans. The ideology of loyalism meant loyalty to the monarch and empire, and adherence to the beliefs and institutions essential to the preservation of a way of life different from that in the United States.
By the late 19th century...
And he's totally right, too, right? With the death of Queen Elizabeth just a few short weeks ago now, Queen Elizabeth II, as of the time of recording this, 24th of September, and now having King Charles, right? God bless the king and whatnot. This is exactly what did happen, right? And still in modern Canadian society, though it is a lot different than it was in the 1910s or 1890s at this point, there is still that sort of loyalist, though it's a bit more of a soft, adherence to the crown, right? So when you join the Canadian Armed Forces, as I did, you take an oath to swear allegiance to Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs, and kingdom. And so now it will be King Charles. And this sort of soft power, right, this sort of cultural power, I think is something that the British monarchy understands really, really well, and has really still to this day. I don't know as much about Australia and New Zealand and whatnot, or South Africa, but in Canada still really does have, I think, impact on Canadian society.
Hardcore Canadian nationalists had come to define themselves through a kind of extreme loyalty to everything British. So they always wanted Canadians to fight in British wars and fly the Union Jack everywhere and have a deep and passionate love for the British royal family and things like that. Britain was viewed as Canada's wise and loving protector, keeping the country safe from those horrible American traitors to the crown. I should also note that a lot of this Anglophilia was also tied up in a very narrow ethnic notion of what it meant to be Canadian, which is to say a good Canadian was not just somebody who was loyal to the so-called British connection, but was also of good British ethnic stock himself. There was a lot of looking down on America as a country that had too many blacks and Jews and Mexicans, which just shows how this idea of the perfectly British Canada was kind of a cover for a lot of more racist views as well. But in any case, it would be fair to say that the Canadian nationalism of that era was quite right-wing. But this philosophy didn't last long. The British Empire was already sort of starting to break down by the early 20th century, and as Canada grew to be a more wealthy and successful country in its own right, a lot of the Canadian political establishment decided that they didn't really like or need the British connection all that much. Canada...
And one thing too, I don't remember if he mentions it, so I might be repeating him, so I'll be quick, but you have to remember too that Quebec, being the French-speaking province and the French culturally dominated language and everything, definitely did not have this British connection as well. And through the Boer War, which was Canada's first foreign war that they ever fought, and World War I, the issues with conscription up to World War II, right? There was that clear divide politically between Anglo-Canadians and Quebecois, or French Canadians.
Negotiated full political independence from Britain in 1931, and from then on
under
considered itself a country that was equal to Britain, not subordinate to it. Now, there still exists a kind of soft aftermath of British nationalism in Canada, and it still tends to mostly revolve around being proud of British-style things that Canada has and America doesn't, like a political connection to the British royal family, or the countries of the Commonwealth, or the Westminster parliamentary system, and things like that. And even today, Canadians are still taught to be weirdly smug about the British role in the War of 1812. But the big story of late 20th century Canada was the development of a new left-wing form of anti-American nationalism to replace the old right-wing one. In the aftermath of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, anti-Americanism became a popular cause all over the world. Some of this was born from resentment at how powerful America had become in the aftermath of the war, and a lot of it was the result of propaganda efforts from the USSR, which had come to see the United States as its main rival in the new post-war world order. The most popular strain of post-war anti-Americanism consisted of portraying the United States as this very reactionary, right-wing capitalist empire, a cruel society full of racists and gun violence and serial killers and religious maniacs and rampant poverty. To varying degrees, this became a popular way of looking at the United States all over the world, but I would say...
Which if you go on Reddit, even in September 2022, same thing.
It gained particular traction in Canada just because there was a real need for a new style of anti-Americanism to fill the void left by the departure of the anti-Americanism of the British Empire. And as the 20th century drew to a close, a very new form of nationalism had taken root in Canada. Whenever the Canadian government did anything left-wing, it could be portrayed as something that was very proud and patriotic, because of course it was something that those evil right-wing Americans would never do. Yeah. Canada's decision to not participate in the Vietnam War and the introduction of universal government-run health insurance became two big new sources of patriotism, for instance. And so too did the...
Yeah, and in Vietnam too, another important thing to remember is that very, very few countries, I think maybe Thailand, Australia, and I think a few other allies actually joined the United States in Vietnam. So Canada staying out of it was really, it was the norm, not the exception.
Passage of broadly liberal legislation on things like guns and abortion and LGBT rights and immigration. In other words, Canada's anti-American purpose was completely reimagined. The old loyalist notion of a Canada that was better than America because it had maintained ties to the British Empire and British institutions was put aside and replaced by a new theory that said that Canada's purpose was to be better than America by having more left-wing government policies. And this wound wound up being a much stronger, more popular form of nationalism than the old British kind had ever been. Canada's British anti-Americanism had always focused mostly on foreign policy and the symbols and ceremonies of British politics. Most normal Canadians didn't really care much about this or even found it a little bit demeaning. Stuff like Medicare and gun control, however, was very attractive to what was now a very large Canadian middle class who had a lot of anxieties about personal safety and financial security that liberal social programs of this sort helped address. A recent poll from the Association for Canadian Studies found that most Canadians now consider the Canadian healthcare system to be a bigger source of national pride than the flag, constitution, or national anthem. Canada's health,
which now, thanks to COVID, is definitely in dire straits, to say the least.
Healthcare system is not actually rated that highly in the global scheme of things, but at least it's free, and America's isn't, and that's all.
It's taxpayer funded, but
that most Canadians really care about. The popularity
really
of this
free,
kind of thing is also one of the reasons why life has become quite difficult for conservative politicians in Canada. Since so much of Canadian nationalism is now bound up in left-wing social programs that conservatives generally don't like, they are constantly under attack for being unpatriotic. The left-wing Canadian nationalists of today will reliably paint conservatism as some sort of sinister American ideology that has no place in this country.
And that sentence right there was the one that was like, okay, yeah, I get it. Because now we have Pierre Poilievre, right? Probably it's a terrible mispronunciation, but already you see the articles in the National Post of this is the Americanization of Canadian politics, the Americanization of this. Pierre Poilievre is too American. This always happens, and I'm not voicing my support for him as an individual, but just to overall say that I think conservatives are generally painted unfairly as being too American. Whether that's true, that's up to you, right? But that is something that definitely does happen in Canadian political society.
Conservatives don't really have a good answer to that. They basically just have to fake liking social programs they obviously don't and hope that people will buy it. I mean, you sometimes run into Canadian conservatives who are like, hey, maybe we can bring back the old British nationalism. But of course, that's extremely difficult to do given how much racial and colonialist baggage that stuff has at this point. Today, most polling data suggests that Canadians overwhelmingly regard the United States as a society much, much worse than their own. For example, here is some data from a 2016 survey from the Angus Reid Institute. And just in case anybody was wondering, this poll was taken before Donald Trump was elected president. Only 15% of Canadians described the United States as a caring society, compared to 68% who described Canada that way. Only 17% agreed that America is a country I would be proud to live in. And why is that? Well, only 8% of Canadians said that they think America has safe cities, and only 17% said it has a healthy natural environment. 64% of Canadians said that they think America is full of racial division, while only 20% think that Canada has that problem. Those last figures are also a good reminder of why, contrary to popular belief, nationalism does not have to be bound up in racism or white supremacy. If we accept the idea that nationalism is primarily about thinking that your country is better than some other country, then it logically follows that one of the ways you might think your country is better is that it is less racist than that horrible bigoted place over there. Anyway.
Yeah, and this is something that I've also discussed at large, where America is such a large country. It's a ginormous country, 330 million people, right, living in it. And Canada, we have 36 million. So more people live, in the state of California than live in Canada, right? And so there is this sort of, this portrait of this place is awful and it's terrible. And I mean, hey, America has its issues. Every country has its issues. What I would be interested, though, and if you are Canadian, what do you think of somewhere like England or Germany or France, right? I would be curious to see, or, even somewhere like, I don't know, even Mexico, right? One of our North American neighbors. And to see the differences between that and the United States. That would be sort of an interesting thing to see.
As you can probably tell, I am not a big fan of Canadian nationalism. I think it's an extremely petty ideology, mostly based around Canadian insecurity and these very gross and extreme stereotypes of America that are not fair or accurate at all. But the problem with Canadian nationalism isn't just that I find it annoying. Nationalism is an ideology that tends to revolve heavily around what the government does, because of course the government is what
it prohibits
runs
change.
the nation. And when you have a very nationalistic government, as Canada usually does, one of the things that inevitably happens is that you develop this class of people who try to secure a lot of power and money for themselves by aggressively sucking up to that government and trying to portray the things that they want as things that are in the national interest. Canada does basically all of its trade with the United States because the United States is this huge, successful, prosperous country just brimming with customers and consumer goods that also happens to be right next door. By any objective measure, being the #1 trading partner of the United States has been something that has been very good for Canada and is a big reason why Canada
NAFTA
is one of the richest countries in the entire world. But there has always been tremendous insecurity about this fact in Canada because America's supposed to be the bad guy, right? Trying to make Canada trade less with America has thus been one of the great ongoing projects of Canadian nationalists over the years. Two of the most divisive elections in Canadian history in 1911 and 1988 were fought over this issue. I want to show you a clip from the 88 election. The Conservative candidate, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, was in favor of establishing free trade with America, while the Liberal candidate, former Prime Minister John Turner, was against it. Listen carefully to the language they use as they argue about the issue in this debate.
I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada. We built a country.
Right? He said, I love Canada, as if you have to put that because, you know, you're running to be the prime minister of the country. But no, you got to say, I love Canada. I know other political leaders do this too, but it's funny.
East and west and north, we built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it. With one signature of a pen, you've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
You see that Prime Minister Mulroney is trying to argue in favor of free trade on the grounds that it is good for the Canadian economy. And then Prime Minister Turner basically says that some things are more important than the economy, like not being part of the United States. And in the end, they both sort of won. Mulroney was re-elected and Canada got free trade with the United States. But there was also a ton of exemptions made for certain industries in which it was deemed part of the national interest to protect them from American competition. This included banking, telecommunications, transportation, dairy, and anything that could be slotted into the broad category of culture, including movies, music, television, and news.
So one thing is that on Canadian radio, we have this thing called CanCon, which is short for Canadian content, no shock there. And where radio stations have to play 50% of their content coming from Canadian artists, right? So a lot of and I personally think that although you might disagree with this program politically, I think it's been highly successful, incredibly successful, because it really does further promote Canadian culture. However, this does have its backsides as well, right? Where the Canadian government does spend a lot of money on these programs, and whether people watch them is not really known. I think with something like music, it works very well because Canada has a lot of really great and talented musical artists. And obviously making music is much different than making a film, especially now in 2022 when you can make music on your computer by yourself and that's it. But with other things like TV shows and film series that are on the CBC, you know, the kind of question gets brought up, right? Well, who's actually watching these? And is it better, you know, when you go to Cineplex, which is a Canadian movie chain, all the films that are there are American, mostly, right? Maybe a few foreign ones, but mostly all American. Just as it is here in Austria when I go to the cinemas and it's all American movies.
Protected from US competition, Canadian companies that specialize in these industries have become very large and successful, but also tend to straddle Canadians with very high prices for very subpar products and services. For example, it has been estimated that Canadians pay some of the highest milk prices on Earth because of the degree that we block cheaper US dairy imports. Canadians likewise pay some of the highest cell phone fees on Earth and have some of the crappiest plans because the Canadian telephone industry is dominated by a few large Canadian corporations and we don't allow the American companies to come up here and compete with them.
And that's one point I will make. I used to pay $50 a month for my cell phone plan in Canada, where I got 5 gigs of data and unlimited talk and text. Here in Austria, I have 5 gigs, unlimited talk and text, same thing throughout the entire EU, and I pay €10 a month. And I bought my SIM card in a grocery store. Yeah.
Headline in the Financial Post recently put it, this kind of setup is not good for consumers, but great for investors. Or in other words, while the vast majority of Canadians are getting screwed, the small minority of people who own these protected companies or own stocks in them are making a lot of money and doing just fine. The existence of large government-protected companies making a lot of money on the backs of the common man seems like the sort of thing you'd expect left-wingers to be very up in arms about. But left-wingers in Canada do not tend to be bothered that much by this sort of thing.
Sometimes.
They tend to be very nationalistic
I think this is changing.
And thus buy into this idea that protecting Canada from America matters more than anything else. So is there an alternative to all of this? Is there a way to escape the hysterical and destructive anti-American nature of Canadian nationalism? I'm actually not really sure that there is. Just because Canada's whole existence is basically permanently tied to being not America. So until the day comes when Canada and America join together, anti-Americanism will always be a big part of what this country is all about. But that being said, I do think that one potentially viable alternative to nationalism is something that we could call culturalism. Culturalism means honoring the naturally existing culture of a place rather than some vision of the national interest dreamed up by a government looking to justify its own existence or special interests seeking money and power. Canadians and Americans share what is basically a common culture. I made a whole video about this, but Canadians are generally unable to appreciate their culture because we are taught to only find worth in things that make us different or better than America. This results in Canadians having a deep lack of gratitude for the many things that actually make us quite distinct in the global scheme of things. Instead, all we have is an omnipresent national anxiety that Canada is this weak, fragile, failing place because we're too much like America, or a kind of arrogant hypocrisy in which Canadians are very righteously anti-American while also lacking any self-awareness of just how American they are. Now, culture...
Yeah, and that's one thing I've encountered over here where you meet sort of Americans and Canadians and whatnot. And a lot of Americans that live abroad, at least the ones that I've met, they're very anti-American themselves, and so they go, it's so much better living in Canada. Yeah, exactly. So there's sort of that dissonance, I would say, and that sort of very, very anti-Americanism that even that Europeans here sort of understand that, oh, well, Canada's so much better. It's so much better in this way, but culturally we're very similar, economically we're very similar, and albeit though we have some social programs, the difference is here I get 5 weeks of vacation minimum by law, and in Canada I get 10 days. So it is.
Is obviously a very difficult thing to define, particularly in diverse societies like Canada and America. But I do think it is entirely possible to define North American culture in an organic, bottom-up way. A way that looks to the lived experiences of ordinary people and seeks to celebrate the commonalities that unite us as citizens of a shared continent, including geography, language, and entertainment, customs of work, food, and family, and values of liberty, tolerance, and justice. It is through this, and not the worship of an arbitrary national division, that Canadians have a recipe for a sense of identity that is healthy and useful and meaningful. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. This is a video I have been wanting to make for a while, a sort of in-depth deconstruction of the Canadian identity, sort of a counterbalance to some of the lighter, more superficial stuff I often make about Canada, like the video I made last week. And talking of last week's video, as predicted, this channel has now officially passed over 100,000 subscribers.
And now he's at almost 1 million subscribers, which is crazy. So, hey, Hope you guys enjoyed that one. Thank you very much for joining me on that. This is one of my favorite videos. Not every single point I completely agree with. I got into some of the points that I do, some of them that I don't. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I know you guys want to see more alternative history stuff, World War II stuff. So I'll be getting into that in tomorrow's video. You'll see what it is. All right, with that, thank you all again. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.